بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين حبيب إله العالمين بالقاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين صلوات اللهم صل على محمد واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم. States in the Holy Quran in the chapter صلوا على محمد وعلى محمد. He states سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. Surely we will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it is made clear to them that He is the truth. أولم يكفي بربك أنه على كل شيء شهيد. Is it not sufficient for you that your Lord bears witness over all things? صدق الله العلي العظيم. آمنا بالله. Before we continue this discourse, today our goal is to talk about evolution. But before we talk about evolution, it's important for us to remember that today is the day of the martyrdom of Imam Salamullahi alayhi Amir al-Mu'mineen. And that the holy household of the family of Amir al-Mu'mineen and the Holy Prophet were going through a tough time. It was very sad for them, very sorrowful. The women were still crying, right? The Imam's body, Salamullahi alayhi, was buried, and now everybody was in mourning. So it's important for us to stay sad and sorrowful, to try to reduce the amount of joking, amongst ourselves, to think about it as though we have someone in our family who has passed away, right? So keep that in mind and live today and the next days up until Eid with that sensibility, right? So that you really connect with Ahlul Bayt, okay? And the orphans. Really connecting with the orphans becomes tantamount, becomes so important, because now not only is this the last few days of the month of Ramadan that the holy household is spending without their father and the leader of their family now, but soon it will be Eid and the kids will be without a father. So keep that in mind and make sure that you carry that with you in your heart in these next upcoming days. We mentioned, of course, that Imam Ali Salamullahi alayhi, as in the lecture yesterday, that the Imam dedicated his life to teaching humanity about Tawheed, and that is the role of the representatives of Allah. We were able to understand then that the reason why, in actual fact, the Imam was assassinated was because of that very fact. Because propagating the truth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the unlimited creator brings people to the path, right? And prevents people from living aimless, pointless lives where they can be controlled by the powers that be. And so we understand then that the very reason why the Imam was targeted and why the believers were targeted and why the Ahlul Bayt were targeted was because they represented Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they were assassinated because they were teaching Tawheed. That's the reality. Don't think that there's any other reason, right? We say yes, power and money, but the reality is power and money, was the motivation for these evil individuals to kill the Imam and the rest of our Imams and the Holy Prophet. Why? Because they were teaching people the path to the truth, the path to Tawheed. And so that's why it becomes important for us to learn theology, right? And that's why we're doing this discourse, this coursework from the Knowledge Seekers program. This is the very first series that we give in the Knowledge Seekers. If you're interested, go to Knowledge Seekers 14 on Instagram, sign up, and inshallah we will send you information about it. Okay? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. About upcoming courses and so on. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. So today we want to talk about evolution, and in order to address the issue of evolution, it's important for us to first define it linguistically, see how it's used in everyday life in terms of usage as a term, and then we want to look at it as a term of science. How is it used in science? Evolution, right? So as a term, if you look up the word evolution in the dictionary, you'll find that evolution means the gradual development or change of something from one state to another. Now, in terms of usage, right, we would say something like, oh, over the years, I've evolved as a person, right? Or I've seen this young man evolve over the years from being, a young reciter that recited on the podium to now becoming a great reciter who recites on the international stage, right? So that evolution then involves what? The gradual development of something. So now that's in terms of linguistic usage, and linguistics, and in terms of usage. Next, we want to move on to how is it used as a term in science. Well, evolution in itself, in its meaning, at its core, has the same as the linguistic meaning. But it is of two types, evolution that is. Microevolution and macroevolution. Now, what are the differences between the two? Microevolution is considered to be the gradual changes within a species, as a result of natural selection. This is what's called the survival of the fittest. Okay? And this is what Darwin refers to in his book, The Origin of the Species. Macroevolution is considered to be the gradual change that causes one species to turn into a completely different species. This is where we have a point of contention. This is what we really need to discuss. Is there such a thing or not? Is there enough evidence of this or not? Okay, Dr. Khan? Yes? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So, of course, when we look at microevolution, it's clear to us that it exists because we watch it on all the time on National Geographic and on the Discovery Channel, right? We see the YouTube videos of the gazelle being chased by the cheetahs, right? The weak gazelle is killed and consumed by the cheetahs, and those that don't capture, like that lonely lion that's withering away, he doesn't have an ability to capture his own prey, and so he ends up dying and his genes don't continue forward, right? Instead, the strong lion survives, the strong gazelle survives, right? So this is agreed upon, no two people will differ on. As for macroevolution, to understand it, we need to understand first Charles Darwin and his work, The Origin of the Species. Charles Darwin himself was a scientist, but he was a self-taught scientist. He was actually a botanist. His father was a physician. He wanted him to be a doctor, but he was too interested in plants. He would spend hours and days just going around in the fields and taking samples of flowers and plants and cataloging them. He made such an extensive catalog that he would present it to the Royal Botany Society in the UK, and they would commend him for his work, and they would encourage him to catalog all the plants of the world. They suggested to him to actually do that. So he approaches his father, convinces his father to bankroll a trip around the world where he would document the plants of the world. And he goes on this trip, and with him is a map maker who would actually draw out the map of the world. In his trip, while he is on his trip, he gets to an area called the Galapagos Islands. And what does he notice? He notices between the islands that there are finches. These finches, they all look the same, but their beaks differ. He noticed that the reason why there were differences in their beaks from one island to the other is because of a difference in their diet. He found that some of the finches ate worms, so they had long beaks, while others ate seeds, so they had shorter, stubby beaks, and so on. He realized then that through natural selection, which is a term that he actually used, he used the term natural selection, right, in his book, The Origin of the Species. He said that this is a natural adaptation as a result of natural selection that has helped these birds adapt to the environment they're in so that they can actually eat the diet that's available on the island where they exist. Nowhere in his book does he mention that humans came from apes. Nowhere in his book, The Origin of the Species, does he mention that humans were at one point aquatic, then they became amphibious, then they became Homo erectus, and then Homo sapiens, or before that even apes. Nowhere in The Origin of the Species does he say that humans were originally apes. In chapter 6 of his book, this is the only thing that he mentions about the change of one species to another. He says that he observed a bear. And the bear was in the water catching fish. He said he noticed that that bear's mouth was open as he was trying to usher the fish into his mouth. He noticed the similarity between this fishing style or method and that of a whale. The whale would also open up its mouth, right, allowing the fish to enter. So he said, I can perhaps see how in the future a bear can turn into a whale. All right, so that's the only thing that he mentioned in his book. So if you read the entire book, that's the only thing. He doesn't actually give proof that this can happen. None. None at all. But rather, his statement is very speculative. And it's completely unscientific. Why? Because I might enter the ocean, open up my mouth, and usher some fish into my mouth, right? Does that mean that now, I'm going to turn into a whale? That makes absolutely no scientific or logical sense. In order to make such a statement, a scientist must show evidence, empirical evidence, that such a thing would actually occur. And he had none. And in actual fact, the statement itself clearly contradicts what we've learned in school today as a point of fact. That humans originally were, animals, fish, and then they moved on to the earth, the land, and they became amphibious, and then after that they turned into whatever, apes, and then humans, and that sort of thing. Or they were single-celled organisms, and that's where they started, and then this evolution happened. Not only is this not mentioned in Charles Darwin's book, right? But this, unfortunately, has been taught to us as though it's fact, when really, it's completely unfactual. So now, we need to address the issue of this idea then that we're taught that humans came from apes. Because really, that's what evolution is in terms of how we're taught it in school. Agreed? If you agree, say I agree. So let's address that. In order to be able to prove that a human came from an ape, the anthropologists and the paleontologists and the scientists, quote unquote, and you'll see why I said quote unquote in a minute, okay? These scientists specifically, they wanted wholeheartedly to be able to connect between the ape and the human. Why? Because they saw similarities, right? In the hands, in the fact that they walk erectly, the fact their eyes, how they might reason, right? So they wanted to find a link. That link, they called the missing link. And there are many, many forms of this missing link, and I want to mention a few of them. for you, to you. First, they suggested it was Neanderthal man. Then they suggested it was Java man. Then they suggested it was Piltdown man. Then they suggested it was Tong child. Then they suggested it was Heidelberg man. Then they suggested it was Homo habilis. Then they suggested it was Lucy. And then they suggested it was Alex, right? Australopithecus sediba. Those are all, it's a mouthful, so I had to read it to you. Right? These are at least 8 suggested missing links. None of them were proven to be the missing link. None. The last ones turned out to be small apes. That's it. Now, even though when they discovered them, they made it seem as though this is fact. Then later on, when their claims were discredited, thankfully they came out and said, oh no, we were mistaken. Sorry, oops. But in modern curricula today, it's still being taught as point of fact. Am I right? If I'm right, say you're right. Am I right? If I'm right, say I'm right. I always tell my wife to tell me I'm right. I love to hear that I'm right. Anyway, so what happens then is, okay, so they abandon this idea of the missing link. So the scientific community actually abandoned the idea of the missing link. Why? Because they weren't able to show any evidence of it. Now, why is it that such a claim would be made? And I want to give you a simple example. I was watching the Discovery Channel one day, and this paleontologist has discovered the head of what looked to be canine skull, his canine head. So he took it into his lab and he 3D scanned it. Then he brought a CGI artist, a 3D artist, and after he scanned the 3D skull, he told him, I want you to make the spine. So he made a spine for him. He said, well, what do you want the spine to look like? He said, well, because he has a big head, I picture him like a pit bull, so give him a kind of a wide, short spine. He said, okay. He said, what about the legs? He said, back legs need to be short and stubby. Front legs, very similar to a pit bull. He said, okay. He said, what about the tail? Long, short? He said, no, short. Exactly like a pit bull. Where's the evidence? No evidence. This is all speculative. Because all he has is what? A skull, right? Then he says to him, okay, what about the muscles? He puts the muscles on, thick muscles on the back, stubby. Is this a short dog? Yes, it's shorter. And in his mind, he thought pit bull, pit bull and bulldog. Then he says to him, what about the fur? Is it long or is it short? He says, short. Did he get all this information from extracting the DNA from the skull? No. He was making it up as he went along. Then he said, okay, what about the color of the coat, the fur? He said, gray. He said, oh, and put some stripes on his back. Long stripes, short stripes. He said, no, short stripes. It looks better that way. Where's the science? That's completely unscientific to do, right? How could you do something like that and then sell it as though it's point of fact? Let's look at, for example, Gregor Mendel. Everybody's heard of Gregor Mendel? Mendelian genetics, right? We learn it as point of fact in high school and in college. Turns out, Mendel's quadrants were completely false. He actually fudged his results. Yes. Complete sham. Complete lie. Okay? Why did he do this? Why do certain scientists do this? There are three reasons that this could happen. One is notoriety and fame. They want to be known for discovering something. Two, any good researcher will tell you, and I know we have some PhDs here, right? Any good researcher will tell you, grant dollars and funding. If I want to continue research, I need the grant dollars. So I have to show that I've discovered something that no one else has discovered, or I'm on the brink of discovering something, right? Lastly, who is funding these projects? That's the next thing I need to look at. The third reason is who's funding? Who are the patrons, right? Who wants to control the narrative, right? Whoever has power and money wants to control that narrative. Whoever is giving money to the universities, and we've seen that recently, right? When the head of Harvard and MIT and the Wharton School of Business, University of Pennsylvania, were placed in front of Congress and they were grilled, do you believe in this state or not? Do you believe this is, and we saw it. Who's funding? Who determines what's right and what's wrong? Whoever's funding, you see? They have that level of control. They want to control the narrative. So the next thing then that they suggested to us after the missing link is, well, Sheikhna, what about the Human Genome Project, right? Now this is a project that sought to basically map the human genome. And part of that work was to look at animal genetics as well and compare it to human genetics. So the scientists now, they come to us and what do they say? They say, hang on, but 99% of an ape's genes, genetics, are the same as a human being. So we must be ancestors. Ya subhanallah, really? How do we respond? We say, look, 37% of the genes of a fruit fly are shared with us. Does that mean our ancestors are fruit flies? That is so unscientific and illogical, right? Instead, what we should be looking at is what? Obviously, the answer is no, right? It's a rhetorical question, right? But why is it that we have similarities? Why is it that certain creations, these creations have similarities in their genes? Well, the reason why is because we have the same base code. That's why, right? So if we're the type of animal that has eyes, then on our genetic code in our DNA, we'll have an area for eyes, right? So we'll be similar because we all have eyes. Let's say we have limbs An insect has limbs, we have limbs, so we share limbs, right? In the genetic code. We have a head. Guess what? Insects have a head. An abdomen, right? A thorax. You see? So all of these shared variables become part of the DNA, which means then that the base code is the same. Now, any good programmer, and I was talking to some programmers in Silicon Valley, and we were talking about this, and they said to me, one of them said to the other, he said, when you have a good base code, right, do you ever rewrite it and make a new base code, or do you build on that same base code? Any good programmer will tell you what? Muhammad Ali will tell you, no, you use the same base code, right? Yeah. Okay. And not just that, that the base code is like an essay that a writer would write. Okay? The base code is exactly like the style of an essayist. An essay that is written by someone reflects the style and the character and the characteristics of the author. Agreed? And the same goes with a program that is written by a programmer. The base code is reflective of what? Of the author of that code. Am I right? Yes. So that means then we all have the same programmer. That's what it means. That's simply what it means, right? And any logical person will agree with this. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us, inshallah, to continue this discourse so that we can come closer and closer to Allah. It's important for us to look at these points of confusion and these suggestions and be able to have the answers and know how to respond, inshallah. I look forward, inshallah, tomorrow to continuing with a new mabhath bi'awnihi ta'ala. Until then, we say alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala sayyidil mursaleen wal fatiha ala arwah al marhumin masbuqatan mashfu'atan bis salati ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat.